The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay here on KSQD. I'm your host, Len B.A. It is my great pleasure today to have as my guest Dr. David Scheel. David Scheel is a field-oriented ecologist with experience in remote and wilderness settings in Africa and Alaska. He joined the Alaska Pacific University in 2000 and teaches courses in marine biology, aquarium husbandry, and animal behavior. He began working with marine predators in 1993. In his marine research, he has worked with fisheries, marine birds and mammals, and marine invertebrates in Prince William Sound and the northern Gulf of Alaska. David specializes in the ecology and evolution of predator-prey relations and habitat use, and he has conducted theoretical, field, and laboratory studies in this area. His interests include the theory and philosophy of evolution, the evolution of consciousness, animal behavior, predator-prey ecology, ecology of social predators, and cephalopod biology. His research since 1995 examines the biology of the Giant Pacific Octopus and includes field studies in Prince William Sound conducted in the intertidal, by scuba diving, and by submersible. The octopus studies also brought David to Tatitlek, Chenega Bay, and Port Graham villages, where he worked with Native Alaskans to improve his understanding of octopus ecology through traditional ecological knowledge. With his students, David has discovered a new octopus species in Alaskan waters. He collaborates on behavioral studies of octopuses in Moorea and Australia. David is an NAUI certified rescue diver and AAUS scientific diver, an aquarium enthusiast, and a wildlife photographer. He has 2 daughters. In Many Things Under a Rock, his new book, Many Things Under a Rock, The Mysteries of Octopuses, Dr. Scheel shares his research as well as that of other marine biologists to show us much of what has been learned and remains to be understood about these amazing creatures, octopuses. Dr. David Scheel, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Hi, thanks for having me on your show.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. It's really exciting. I'm a little ways into your book and have been really enjoying it. It's beautifully written, and I just love, there's so much in there. You've studied octopuses for some 25 years. What captivated you about them all those years ago when you began?
Yeah, I've always been captivated by octopuses, I think. When I was about 10, I read about them in Jacques Cousteau's book, The Soft Intelligence, and I found them very interesting. But I didn't necessarily set out to make a career with octopuses. I kind of fell into that work following the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Prince William Sound.
Yeah, and you were then looking to try and get a sense of what the octopus population was like, right?
Yeah, that's right. In Prince William Sound and around sort of south central coastal Alaska, the communities of Alaska natives often harvest a good deal of their food from the intertidal or from the oceans. And so there was concern over what the oil spill had done to octopus populations. And that was sort of the impetus to start studying them. We were never able to answer that basic question of what was the effect of the oil on the octopuses, simply because there were no preceding data. There was no earlier data about the octopuses. So we couldn't look for a sort of before-after state of octopus populations. But I just kept going from there because they're such a fascinating animal to work with.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, nothing to compare to. there's a growing perception that octopuses are far more intelligent than we might have expected for a mollusk. What's the evidence for octopus intelligence?
Well, there's all kinds of evidence. They're behaviorally very complex animals to begin with, and then on top of that, when you look at their neural anatomy, they have very large brains, particularly for a mollusk. Um, and then on top of that, their brains are their neural anatomy, how their brain and nerves are laid out throughout their body is very different from the way a human is laid out. About two-thirds of the nerve cells that an octopus has in its body will be located out in the distributed among the arms and the skin and the muscles. Whereas that number for us, 98% of the brains of a human or the nerves of a human are in the brain itself. So it's a very different neural organization. And then even more recently, very recent science is starting to show us how the octopuses have a very unique ability to edit their own genetic material, edit their own RNA. And that seems to be a function of coping with temperature differences across a broad range from the tropics to the poles, so that no matter what the temperature is, the different species of octopuses can be locally adapted to that temperature and able to continue to be very active, engaging animals, even if it's normally for another mollusk, the cold might be slowing down their nerve signals.
Wow. So they're actually able to change their body's metabolism through their own genetic material. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's about right. I'm not a geneticist, but the way I understand it, that like us, they have DNA in their cells, which is the genetic blueprints that are inherited from one generation to the next. And like us, the DNA is transcribed into RNA. And that RNA is the material that goes out into the cells and is functioning in building the proteins and initiating regulatory chains and all of that sort of stuff. And in the octopuses, one of the cold water adaptations that allows octopuses to inhabit cold water has been to be very heavily editing the RNA after it's been transcribed from the DNA. And that editing appears to allow the octopuses to adapt to temperature. And one of the places where the most editing occurs is in the nerve cells and in the molecules that regulate nervous function. And the supposition right now, and again, a lot of this is relatively new science, the supposition right now is that that allows these animals to maintain faster nerve signaling even in the cold.
Wow. That's a unique, I mean, it's certainly not a capability that we have to do that sort of adaptation.
Yeah, there's been a couple of different reports that I've seen. One that octopuses do this vastly more than you would suspect, but another one is that the end result is very similar to some of the diversification of genetic information that is found in humans, in the sense that they're modifying the same kinds of things to be intelligent that maybe got modified in our own evolution for us to be intelligent. But I will say to those of you who've done this work and are now listening, yeah, I know I'm not an expert in this area of DNA editing and neurophysiology, and I do apologize if I got any of the details wrong.
Well, that still gives a kind of an overview of something going on. And you mentioned their behavior is very, very complex. What kinds of skills or complex behavior have they exhibited that shows their intelligence?
Yeah, well, they're very famous for being able to open jars, and they're very sophisticated camouflage behavior, for example. I do agree these are great examples of intelligent behavior, and octopuses use them to great advantage. I like to talk about two other aspects of octopus intelligence that don't get quite as much attention, but I think they're fascinating. And that is the way they select their food and the way they interact with one another. Um, so one of the points I make in Many Things Under a Rock is that the octopuses, when they forage in the intertidal, we were able to show that they're collecting, they're choosing prey from what's available, and they're very selective. They prefer the larger species, and within a species, they're taking larger individuals. And that's kind of fascinating. It's not unexpected, but it's kind of fascinating because it shows that they're doing two things. They're making judgments. They're judging the size of the animal against what they expect to find. But they're also exercising restraint because they have to pass over the smaller ones they might find in order to select only the bigger ones. And it's a little bit surprising that these animals are exercising restraint. It's surprising to us. It's probably not surprising to them at all. It's surprising to us because we tend to think of it in the context of like the famous marshmallow test that psychologists have done with young children. And this is a simple test in which you give a young child a marshmallow, and then you tell them, I'm going to leave the room. And if you haven't eaten that marshmallow when I come back, if you can wait, I'll give you a second one. You can have two marshmallows, but only if you don't eat it right now. And so older people, older kids, they can handle that just fine. They wait, no problem. Very young kids, they can't handle it at all. They eat it right away. But in the middle, there's this interesting stage in which the child really wants to wait until you can get the second bigger reward, but is struggling to do it. And you'll find them spinning around in their chairs, looking in other directions, basically doing anything they can to distract themselves from the treat in front of them in order to wait for the larger reward. And so, we have animals doing something very similar to that. And of course, we expect a dog can do that, right? It's fun to train your dog to do things like that. But when you see a mollusk doing it, it's very impressive. And cuttlefish can do this, and I suspect octopuses would pass a rigorous. It's never been tried for octopuses yet, but I suspect they would pass a rigorous experimental test of the same structure as the marshmallow test, based merely on the fact that they can be selective when they're foraging.
And you did a lot of research with the giant Pacific octopus, as it's commonly known. And of course, when I don't really know a whole lot about their size, and maybe you could tell us more about that. But when they're first hatched, they're actually quite tiny. So when they're small, they're also foraging for food, right? Is the proportional size of what they're looking for to eat, or change in proportion to their body size, or do they just look for different species? How does that manifest there?
Yeah, definitely a tiny octopus can't catch as large a prey as an adult octopus can. But one of the things to think about is, the crown of arms on an octopus. They have 8 arms surrounding the mouth, right? And that crown is directly around the mouth, and it's used to capture and manipulate food. So what organ is directly around the mouth and is used to manipulate food? Well, the lips are, right? So in many ways, the octopus arms are like extended prehensile lips. And when you think about it that way, when the octopus spreads its arms, that's basically the size of its gape, right? And how far can it open its mouth? Well, as far as it can spread its lips, which are its arms, so as far as it can spread its arms. And so that's kind of an amazing thought, because the octopus can essentially spread its arms around something as big or bigger than it is.
Yeah.
And that's the size of something that it can tackle. So I have seen very modest sized octopuses tackle relatively large prey without any trouble. But obviously there's a limit, and the octopus the size of your thumb is not going to be taking some massive crab with a 2-foot carapace. But by the time the octopus can spread its arms to 2 feet, it will have no problem taking that.
Right. And I've seen crab carapace or shellfish shells with the puncture hole that the octopus makes in order to get at the flesh inside. And I can picture that from your description a little bit, that they can handle something much bigger than you might imagine.
Yeah. They have 3 ways to get into their food. They can make those holes, which are drilled. We call it drilled, but they're basically worn into the shell with some of a thing called the radula, which is an organ specific to mollusks, and some very corrosive saliva that they have that has enzymes to break down the shell. So that's one way. They can pull their prey open just with brute strength. That's the second way. And then they have a beak, very much like a parrot's beak, buried in the muscular mass around the mouth. And they can crack the shell or chip it with that beak. And so the octopus will use one of those 3 ways to get into the food.
Wow. And so they really have to use multiple ways depending on what they're eating and how big it is, right?
Yeah, I once found in Many Things Under a Rock, I write about this large butter clam shell that I found, ironically, under a rock, because that's where all this action happens in the intertidal. And the rock, of course, was part of the den of the octopus. And the octopus had captured this prey and then eaten it and discarded it. And but you could find, usually they try and pull them open, and this was a big, solid, beefy butter clam, and it didn't open. And so then the octopus had tried to drill it, and there were multiple places where it had made a hole partially through the shell, but the shell was simply too thick, and the octopus couldn't drill all the way through. And finally, it had managed to chip the end after what must have been hours trying to get into this food. And once it made a little chip, then it could inject its cephalotoxins, and it ate the clam.
Wow. Yeah. So patience is also something that they're able to exhibit.
Flexibility and persistence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're just tuning in to Talk of the Bay on KSQD, my guest is Dr. David Scheel. He's a field-oriented ecologist affiliated with Alaska Pacific University, and he has just published a new book documenting research in octopuses called Many Things Under a Rock. David, I understand there's over 300 species of octopus, and I wonder if you could tell us about what's the range of sizes? How big do they get, and what are the little ones?
Yeah. There's at least 300 different species of octopuses that occupy sort of the continental shelves, the shallow oceans, and there's more that are in the deep water, and they range in size from very small, really, to the giant Pacific octopus, which is the largest species. The giant Pacific octopus can get up to 100 pounds or more, and we know that it does occasionally get bigger than 100 pounds. So that's the big end of things, but that's a very large octopus. The smaller ones, there's a number of different species. I think there's a pygmy octopus, a Jubaine in Florida, and there's Octopus churchii, which is the zebra octopus, or the lesser Pacific striped octopus, which is this beautiful little octopus that gets, maybe twice as big as the thumb or something like that, maybe a little bigger. And it's this lovely animal it's in a group called the harlequin octopuses, because it has bold black and white patterning on it. There's 2 species. One of them is black and white stripes, and the other one is a mixture of black and white stripes and black and white polka dots. Wow,
that must be really striking when you see one of those.
Yeah, they're a beautiful little animal. They're incredibly hard to find. The sister species that I mentioned, the larger Pacific striped octopus, was found back in the 70s. and its behavior and demeanor and appearance were so different from what people assumed about octopuses that the scientist working on it had trouble getting his thesis work published because he was a new scientist. He was young. He had the misfortune to go to some skeptical reviewers and journal editors, and they said, well, we need more convincing that this kind of weird stuff is actually happening. And so his name is Rodonice. And so the material was never published. And I first heard about it as kind of a rumor in the Cephalopod Society, and no one was ever able to find these animals anymore. And, by the early 1990s, I think people had begun to suspect they might have gone extinct. And then around 2010, some collectors in Central America, I believe, brought up another few animals. They were legally collected under a permit and sold them to the Steinhardt Aquarium. And there's a couple of very excited cephalopod enthusiasts and researchers affiliated with this Steinhardt. So they were able to study these guys in captivity for the first time since Rodonice's work in the 70s, and document that everything he had described was really happening, and so published that paper, these many years later. But since that time, the collectors have not found any more octopuses, or very many more octopuses, and so they are now again unavailable to be seen anywhere. And so, I was able to make a trip to the Steinhardt and get a glimpse of them, but I was not involved in the research or anything like that. But they're just a very amazing animal.
Yeah. And so the giant Pacific being, you said, around 100 pounds, typical adult size, being the biggest known species at this point. Are there stories of even bigger ones? And do you think those stories have any credence to them?
Yeah, one of the things I really enjoyed when I first started working with octopuses, I was new to diving, I was new to marine science, I was new to octopuses, and I was supposed to take teams of divers underwater in Alaska and capture these guys so that we could get, basic biological measurements, like what species is it, how big is it, that kind of stuff. And so I was a little concerned just how big these things could get, because people had told me stories, some of which I relate in many things under a rock. And, the stories kind of blended seamlessly from well-established, well-agreed-upon scientific fact into sort of maybe more and more questionable scientific records, into what were possibly mistaken scientific records, but some people still disputed that, all the way up into mythology, where there were, octopuses taking entire villages off of the shore. And so, that sort of seamless blend from science into uncertainty into mythology was just a lot of fun. And I try to convey some of that in the book.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating to think. I mean, we still see old engravings and paintings that have huge cephalopods. Some cases you can't even tell whether it's an octopus or a squid, but you can tell it has tentacles. Now, you've dived with these creatures a lot, and you've handled them. You've actually tried to collect them in many cases in order to work with them in captivity or weigh them or other things. Could you tell us a little bit about what it's like to handle a creature like that doesn't have a skeleton?
Oh, yeah. They're wonderful escape artists. And, the other thing is that they have suckers on them everywhere. So it's a little bit like wrestling, the muscular offspring of a scarf and a bath mat underwater.
Wow.
So there was one time I was had a great deal of trouble locating an octopus that I was pretty sure was around. It had a transponder on it, a sonic tag that emitted a ping. And I was trying to see what kind of habitat it had settled in after we'd released it. And eventually I found this octopus, and but it was really hard to find her because I was looking for a medium-sized octopus. And what I found was a giant octopus, much larger individual than I had expected, perfectly camouflaged as kelp in dim, murky water. And I eventually realized the pinger was underneath this large octopus, which had eaten the smaller one that I had tagged. And so I decided to recruit this volunteer to my study. And so I had to bring this big octopus up to the surface so we could put the tag that had been on the small octopus that she'd eaten onto the bigger octopus. And so I didn't have, normally I would catch an octopus, I'd put him in a goodie bag, but I didn't have a goodie bag. And so I just picked up this octopus and tried to sort of go to the surface with it cradled in my arms. And I was happy enough with that at first, but then it began to try to jet away, and I would sort of block it, a little bit. You have to be very gentle with them and careful with them in the water so you don't do them any injury. An injured octopus is no good to the kind of behavioral work that I wanted to do. I want healthy, thriving animals. And so eventually the octopus got fed up with me, and it crawled into the space between my dry suit and my the vest on which my tank was mounted, my buoyancy control device, my BCD. And so
Wow.
I couldn't see it then anymore, and I had to have my dive buddy help me get it out from under there so that it wouldn't make its escape from there where I couldn't keep an eye on it. So yeah, they can be a handful.
Yeah. And what do the suckers feel like if they attach to you? I assume they've at least gotten some part of your hand, if not much more of your body at times.
Yeah, octopuses love to hold on to people. They like skin, and their suckers adhere very well to skin. And it feels like you would imagine a suction cup would a little bit, colder in the waters that I'm in. And they very much will cling to you, and if they pull hard enough, they can raise a welt. So you can have if you end up in a contest of some sort with an octopus where they really don't want to let it go, you can end up with a series of sucker-shaped hickeys up your arm.
Wow. Okay. I think I would want to avoid getting that far into it. You describe octopuses in the difficulty of finding them in the first place because they're so good at hiding, and also they're really great at camouflage. And I wonder if you could tell us about the ways that they make themselves hard to find.
Yeah, great question. Octopuses have several strategies to make themselves hard to find, and one we've already mentioned. They excavate and rest in dens. And so they're literally, in Alaska, we literally found them under the rocks. And so that's one way in which they simply avoid notice because you can't see them. But when they're out and about, they have these very rapid and sophisticated color change abilities. And this is all done in the skin, and it's muscularly and neuronally controlled. So it's very rapid. It can happen as fast as you can snap your finger, that they can change their body appearance. And they can do two different things with these muscles in the skin. One is they can change the texture of the skin, and they can erect, sort of papillae or horns or little folds of skin that allow them to become very rugose or very smooth, or in some species, to even look very spindly and thin, like a branching algae or something like that. The other thing they can do is by opening or closing these cells in their skin that contain pigment. The cells are called chromatophores. By opening and closing the chromatophores, they can reveal or hide layers of pigment in their skin so that they can look very white if they're letting the light come through the skin and reflect off of some of these cells that reflect the skin or the light and scatter the light. That reflects white, so they look very pale. Or in some of the species, they also have these reflective cells that can they interact with the wavelengths of light and refract it so that you get really intense blues, for example. And some of them can reflect a little bit of the light, the dominant color that's around them. So I once was swimming through an eelgrass bed, and the octopus looked decidedly green when I was in there because it was reflecting all the green light that the eelgrass was shedding. And then in the uppermost layer, they have these chromatophores, and they have a way to use sort of three different patterns on their chromatophores. They can be kind of uniform colored and blend into a uniform background, like when they're swimming. They can be very mottled colored, so they blend into shells or debris on the bottom, or they can have a very disruptive color. Some areas very light, some areas very dark, big blocks of color, and that breaks up the body outline. And so they tend to be very difficult to discern.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, and it seems like they have a fairly broad range of available color tones as well. Like, well, you described as green, and I've seen them look like, charcoal black when they're in a really dark, next to a dark rock, that in an aquarium setting. And I've seen them on along sand in the wild. Well, the only time I've seen one in the wild, off the shore of Kauai, and it was swimming above the sand, and it was pretty much exactly the same color and texture as the sand. So
Same colored. Yeah. It's pretty amazing. They have very good vision for shades of lightness and darkness, and for texture and particle size. So, but they don't actually see color. They're monochromatic vision. So they see brightness, but they don't see color. And so they're doing that matching by matching particle size and brightness of the background, or by choosing a particular object. There's some wonderful moments in the tropics where I've seen octopuses mimic a particular coral head, and they choosing an object in the environment and adopting a skin texture and color pattern that very precisely mimics the way that appears at a slight distance.
wow, that's amazing. Well, we're going to take a really short break. We'll be right back with more with Dr. David Scheel right after this. Don't touch that dial. And if you're just tuning in, I am here with Dr. David Scheel. He is a marine biologist currently in Alaska, has been in Alaska since 2000. And he has a recently published book, Many Things Under a Rock, The Mystery of Octopuses. And so we're getting, straight from the researcher's mouth here, a whole lot of wonderful stories about these amazing creatures. And we were just talking about the different ways they can disguise themselves. And in your book, David, you compare watching their skin change colors to watching the northern lights. And I wonder if you said they're very fast, like they can change color pretty much instantaneously. But when you say northern lights, that conjures up more of an image of a wave. And I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, that analogy comes from a couple of different properties of both northern lights and octopus color change that maybe not everyone has seen. So in the octopus itself, they can pass waves of color down the body. And this is a display that biologists have termed the moving cloud display, because it moves across the field of the octopus's body like a shadow would pass over the sun, for example. but it's more mobile and changeable than that. It's a little bit more like a murmuration of swallows in the air. If you've seen that, where there's just so many of them in a big flock and the edges move in and out and the shape changes constantly. And it's maybe not incredibly well known unless you're a fan of watching the Northern Lights and have had opportunity to do it. But the Northern Lights move in the sky as well. And these, I was in Cordova, Alaska, on the edge of Prince William Sound one October, and the Northern Lights display started up, and I went out into the mountains a little bit to get a better view of it. And at first, it was this sort of band of faint glowing light around the horizon. And then these bright spots began to appear in that band. And out of each bright spot, a beam of light shot up towards the azimuth, towards straight overhead. And eventually they met overhead, and the band widened. And so you had this center, directly overhead, you had this center down from which came these bands of light like octopus arms, with this glowing fainter area between them, between the arms like web. And then this whole structure began to rotate across the sky. And it was like looking up at the celestial octopus who had the earth in the grasp of her arms.
Wow.
It was a magical moment.
Yeah. And the Northern Lights are an interaction with our magnetic field, right? Which, in fact,
Yes.
does hold us in its arms, her arms, in terms of protecting us from cosmic radiation. It's a very important part of what makes this planet livable. And so I love that analogy. That's beautiful.
Yeah, it was a striking moment and a very beautiful one at that.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, did you see the documentary My Octopus Teacher?
I have heard of that.
But yeah, you've heard of it? Well, I wondered, assuming you've seen it.
Ask?
I want to ask you, I'm always curious about how documentaries, which inevitably consist of footage from multiple time periods, sometimes out of sequence, and then it's edited together to present a coherent story. And I wondered if you found any inconsistencies in that film with what you've learned from your research. Yeah.
Well, I've been involved in some documentaries, and it's true. The filmmakers, the script writers, if you will, or the narrative writers, and the filmmakers very much need that comprehensive, that coherent story, right? And in full disclosure, many things under a rock is narrated in a way to convey the joy and engagement of those stories about octopuses. I was privileged enough to be in a PBS and BBC documentary, Octopus Making Contact, that came out shortly before the one you mentioned. And, we were at some tension at moments of the creative process between, me as a scientist saying, hey, I don't want anything in here that didn't happen. But BBC and PBS have that same attitude towards their nature documentaries. They don't want anything in there that isn't a legitimate portrayal of the story that they're conveying. And so, we were at odds at times about how to structure that, but I think we worked it out. And I think we ended up with a really captivating story about octopuses and people. And, I can only imagine that the people involved with Teacher did the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, in that film, My Octopus Teacher, Craig Foster, the narrator, essentially, he forms a close bond with an individual octopus. And I wondered if you've had any of that experience of repeated contact with the same individual, and if you've noticed, what would I call it, like personality differences, or or anything like that?
Yeah, as you mentioned early in your introduction of me, I have done a lot of my octopus work in fairly remote settings, remote from where I live and remote from, most of the support networks that um, allow a person to get into the water every single day at the same spot and meet the same sea creatures over and over again. So
Right.
most of my repeated contacts with octopuses have been with octopuses in captivity. And that's what octopus making contact is about, is that repeated interaction with one octopus to see. Well, it wasn't an experiment; it was a film, but in order to document how that unfolds and to capture some of what it sort of feels like. And the film PBS's Octopus Making Contact sort of is captivating. Um, is captivated by the relationship between the octopus and my daughter Laurel. And Laurel had kind of grown up around octopuses, and so she didn't have any of that squeamishness or fear or even sort of uninformed curiosity that many people might have when they first encounter an octopus, because she'd seen them her whole life. And so she engaged with the octopus, whose name was Heidi, um, as sort of as a pet, like keeping a pet dog that you couldn't take for walks because it had to stay in the water. And
Yeah.
she has spent a lot of time around octopuses and has become a very accomplished artist. She is the one who the Laurel. My daughter Laurel is in the film with me, but she's also the one who illustrated the book and drew the illustrations in Many Things Under a Rock. And I'm proud dad. I was perfectly delighted to be able to do a project with my daughter in each of those cases. But I particularly wanted Laurel to draw the octopuses because I've been privileged to work with a number of artists over the years, and they do glorious, gorgeous, accomplished art of octopuses, but it very often has a free interpretation of octopus form, one that is more engaged with the joy of the curves and the beauty of artistic expression. And for the book, I really wanted something that captured the octopus as I see them, captures the dynamic lines and tensions of actual behavior as I see it in the octopuses. And because Laurel had grown up with octopuses, I didn't have to coach her about that. The octopus is a very unfamiliar form to a lot of artists, and they don't always see it in motion over many, many different poses. But Laurel had, and so she was able to draw on that depth of experience in sketching her illustrations.
Yeah, and I love the illustrations in the book. They really add so much feeling to the chapters as you
Yeah,
move
and
through.
she's got some that are just brilliantly expressive and very representative of true octopus behavior. And then she has some that are just whimsical and fun and just express that joy of telling stories.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it comes up in many conversations, and I'm curious myself. You mentioned the giant Pacific octopus can, typically adult size around 100 pounds. Can they ever be dangerous to humans? Is there any circumstance where you have to be extremely cautious around them?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, all octopuses are potentially dangerous in one level or another. You asked me earlier about the smaller species, and there's a group of related octopus species, the blue-lined octopuses, that occur in the Indo-Pacific and around the Australian waters. And there's several different species, but they have in common this brilliant blue display when they feel threatened. It's kind
Hmm.
of a "don't mess with me" display. And accompanying that display, they have an incredibly dangerous toxin that if a
Ooh.
human is bitten by one of these blue ringed octopuses, it can stop your breathing for about 20 minutes or so, which is generally deleterious to your health.
No kidding.
For many octopus species, including the ones that you have off of California and that we have, around the North Pacific Rim, the toxins are not so brutal, but they can do a lot of damage. So a bite from an octopus, many of them will swell up and hurt, and that'll be the end of it. But if you're particularly sensitive to the cephalotoxins, or if the particular animal injected a lot of it, or if that particular species has one of the more potent cephalotoxins, then that can lead to wounds that will not heal properly, wounds that never heal, sometimes permanent nerve damage where the pain never goes away. So they can be, not merely as a result of their size, octopuses can be dangerous. When I was first training to work with octopuses, I had some advice from some other people who had captured octopuses for the aquarium trade. And their advice, which I've always tried to heed, is don't put your hand in their mouth.
Good advice on almost any animal.
Advice.
Yeah.
Right. It's good advice for almost any animal. I have to say, I don't always follow it. But with octopuses, it's a little harder to heed than you might expect because they're always trying to pass anything interesting towards their mouth. But that's really where you have to draw the line with an octopus is don't let it taste you.
Huh. Yeah, fascinating that they would.
Mouth, right?
Yeah,
its
just
mouth.
like, well, even human babies try to put everything in their mouth to taste it. So
do octopuses.
Yeah.
And they can taste with their suckers a little bit, and that's fine. The suckers may adhere, they may give you a hickey, they may leave a red mark, but they are seldom going to do any severe damage. There is one case I relate in the book from 1902, I think, from Puget Sound, in which a gentleman fell into the water. Well, he was knocked into the water by killer whales, actually, and yet he didn't need to worry about the killer whales. And in that disruption of trying to get back to his boat, he was in relatively shallow water. He was holding onto his boat, and something grabbed him, and he immediately surmised that it was an octopus. And then there was this battle between the man trying to hold onto the boat and the octopus pulling to see, like, what is this thing that I've found? I'm curious. Can I bring it down to my lair and can I taste it? And the man was able to hold on to the boat, but he was very severely injured by the pulling.
Wow.
Alone. Yeah.
Wow. Amazing. Yeah, because they're, as you said, they're very muscular. Like they're, you might say, strong for their size.
They are very muscular. They are very strong. And different species of octopuses convey that strength a little bit differently. The giant Pacific octopus is sort of this slow, gentle giant. He moves plenty fast, but compared to other octopuses, he doesn't seem that quick, but he's very strong. And the giant Pacific octopus can be very tenacious. You compare this to Octopus cyanea, and they're just lightning fast and strong enough. They're a much smaller animal. They don't get to 100 pounds, but even a 5 or 7 pound Octopus cyanea, which would be a big one, that's a pretty strong bundle of muscle to be contending with.
Interesting. Wow. So how do you tell a male from a female octopus?
Oh, just ask.
Of course.
Right?
That's what I do on the street here around town too. So
yeah, right. So the male octopuses have a modified tip to the third arm on the right side. And that modified tip aids them in passing sperm packets from their own reproductive organ and placing them in the female's reproductive tract. So the male octopus often would simply prefer to mate at arm's reach. The female octopuses can be receptive to mating, but sometimes the male has to try has to make a mating attempt first. And a little octopus, as I've already mentioned, a little octopus is at risk of getting eaten by a big octopus. And many of these cannibalistic moments are in the context of mating, where a small male is trying to mate with a larger female. And if she's hungry or otherwise not receptive, sometimes the meal is more interesting than the mating. And so the males often are trying to mate at arm's reach. And so they pass the sperm packet down the length of this third right arm and then inseminate it into the female's mantle cavity where they can place it in her reproductive tract. So on the third right arm of your octopus, look at the underside of the suckers. And most of the arms, the suckers go all the way to the tip. But in some, in the males, on the third right arm, there will be suckers from the mouth down, and then at some point along the length, the suckers will stop, and there'll be this modified hectocotylus, it's called, this modified spade-like organ that just allows the sperm passage. It doesn't have any suckers on it, though, at that point. But there is a simpler way, but it's much more subtle. That mating appendage is very important to the males, obviously. And many times octopuses explore with their arms, and they can get damaged. So an octopus can lose an arm or have the distal part of an arm bitten off just in its routine day-to-day life. And so the males are a little protective of that third right arm, and they hold it slightly closer to the body in normal motion than they do the other arms or do the female. So even if you can't see the hectocotylus, the way it's modified and get a check on the tip, occasionally you can tell he's kind of favoring that third right. I bet that's a male.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. That's just to watch their carriage, as it were.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So apparently octopuses can hear sounds, and I understand they can also detect scents, right, in the water. What do we know at this point about their, you were telling us that they're monochromatic in their sight, but they can really tell texture and brightness very well. What do we know about their ability to hear and their ability to smell?
Yeah. Octopuses generally have very acute senses and, are remarkable in how much they can detect from the water and their environment. But with the caveat that their senses are a bit different than ours in different ways. So we've talked a little bit about their sight, but in terms of smell or hearing, let's deal with hearing first. In terms of hearing, we know that they can hear, but relatively little is actually known about exactly how they use that hearing. And so, it's a little bit of an open question what they do with it, but it seems that they are aware of the soundscapes in which they live. In terms of their sense of smell, so smell is generally our distance reception of chemical signals, things that are carried on the air.
Yeah.
And taste is generally our contact perception of chemical signals, things that are carried in a liquid or we put into our mouths where they get carried into the saliva. So for animals that live in the water, there's kind of a contact chemical sense and a chemical sense of what's coming in the water. And so even though taste for humans is in the fluids and smell is in the air, taste for octopuses is more like on surfaces that they contact, and smell is more like in the water around them.
Right.
So they have different chemoreceptors for each, but they're located in the suckers. And so they can smell and taste anything they touch.
Wow. That's amazing. That's amazing that they have that all through their entire bodies like that. Well, we only have about 2.5 minutes left. And so I wanted to ask you if you might tell us about, where to find the book, and maybe tell us the origin of the book title, which I thought was a really interesting story.
Yeah, thank you. Many Things Under a Rock, The Mysteries of Octopuses, is available in the U.S. In bookstores everywhere now, and it's available online. It's published by Norton, and if you're interested in more information about it, you can find it at alaskaoctopus.com. That's my webpage, alaskaoctopus.com.
Great.
The title, Many Things Under a Rock, was suggested by the EAC word for octopus. And I apologize to our EAC listeners who might know better than I how to pronounce this word, because I always butcher it a little bit. But the word is Salexguk. Salexguk. And it means a bunch of things under a rock. And I just thought that was such an evocative image, because when I began working with octopuses, everything I learned or needed to know just led me in so many different directions, from monster tales to fisheries management to how to scuba dive, to how vision works. And it seemed like whatever I wanted to know, I had to learn 10 or 12 or 15 other things to begin to approach it. And so I just love that idea of working with octopuses. Led me, every rock I unturned led me to many different things.
That's great. Well, David Scheel, it's been a real delight to have you on the show. I'm sorry we're out of time. I just want to say how much I'm enjoying the book. It's beautifully written. I love your daughter's illustrations, and I'm going to keep right on reading it, even though I don't have another interview with you scheduled yet. But I would certainly welcome you back in the future. And thank you again for being on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. We can certainly do another interview if you like later on in the book.
All right. Fabulous.